The Mojave Desert is for the most part a dry and barren place. This area was ruled by Mexico from 1821 to 1848, but there wasn't much exploration of this desert region. In 1829, Mexico sent an expedition into this desert and happened upon a location that had several artesian springs and a small creek. They named this place Las Vegas, which in English means the meadows or the fertile plain. Paleo Indians had lived in the area of modern-day Las Vegas going back 10,000 years. Paiute tribes followed about 2,000 years ago. The Old Spanish Trail was a group of several trade routes by which you could travel from Santa Fe, New Mexico to points west. These routes were first explored by the Spanish in the early 16th century. Eventually, the trails extended to San Bernardino and Los Angeles in California, and it passed through the Las Vegas oasis. In 1855, the Mormons decided to build a missionary outpost and fort in Las Vegas, the first non-native settlement in the Las Vegas Valley. But crop failures, a drought, and disappointing mining yields made it difficult for the mission to prosper. And during this time, there were mounting tensions between the United States government and Mormon settlers over autonomy and control in the Utah Territory. A federal army led by Colonel Albert S. Johnson was dispatched to the Utah Territory to quell any rebellion, and Mormon forces readied themselves and were led by Daniel H. Wells, leader of the Mormon Nauvoo Legion. And so the far-off Mormon mission in Las Vegas was abandoned in 1857 after only 2 years, as the Mormons took a defensive position for the impending confrontation with the United States government, known as the Utah War. During the American Civil War, federal troops were slated to occupy the Old Mormon Fort at various times to support United States interests in the region, but troops were never garrisoned there. The rights to the Mormon fort after the Mormons abandoned the site were retained by Albert Knapp, one of the original missionaries. Then Albert's brother William inherited ownership. He, in turn, sold the property in 1865 to 3 men, Nathaniel Lewis, Octavius Gass, and Lewis Cole. Octavius Gass initially owned 160 acres, but by 1872 he had bought out his partners and owned the entire 640-acre ranch. Here is a photo of Octavius Gass at his ranch. He was involved in mining, farming, and politics, but he ran into financial difficulties and needed cash. So he obtained a $5,000 loan from a man named Archibald Stewart, using his ranch as collateral. But he defaulted on the loan, and Stewart foreclosed on the property. Archibald Stewart's wife was named Helen. She was born Helen Jane Weiser in Springfield, Illinois, on April the 16th, 1854. Her father was a prospector who moved his family to Sacramento, California. Helen was just shy of her 19th birthday when she married Archibald Stewart in 1873 and moved to Pony Springs, Nevada, 41 miles north of Pioche, Nevada. Pioche is 175 miles north of Las Vegas, and it's the county seat of Lincoln County, Nevada. By the end of the decade, they had 3 children. A mile and a half north of the Stewart's Las Vegas ranch was the 240-acre Kiel Ranch, owned by Conrad Kiel. Kiel had been friends with Octavius Gass, and had believed that Archibald Stewart had swindled gas out of the ranch. So the Kiels and the Stewarts didn't get along. And there were further tensions between Kiel and Stewart, as they were competitors in supplying area miners with vegetables, fruits, livestock, and equipment. Many of the miners worked in El Dorado Canyon mines, about 25 miles south of present-day Lake Mead, which didn't exist back then. Lake Mead was created in 1935 with the completion of Boulder Dam, now known as Hoover Dam. On July the 13th, 1884, Archibald Stewart returned to his ranch after a business trip to El Dorado Canyon. His wife, Helen, told him that one of his employees named Schuler Henry had quit a few days before and went to work for Conrad Kiel. Then he told Helen he wanted his back pay, and Helen said he'd have to wait until her husband gets back, as he handles that. Then, apparently, Schuler Henry said something insulting to Helen and left. Upon Archibald's return to the ranch, she relayed what had happened, and Archibald went to the Kiel ranch to confront Schuler Henry. Shots were fired. Schuler Henry was shot twice, but he survived. Archibald Stewart was killed. At the time, Helen had 4 children and was pregnant with a 5th. Now, at 30 years old, she was a widow. Helen Stewart, Conrad Kiel, and Schuler Henry appeared before a grand jury. Conrad Kiel and Schuler Henry's account of what had taken place was that Archibald Stewart was the aggressor. But Helen Stewart believed her husband was lured to the Kiel ranch and ambushed. The Kiel ranch had always been a haven for drinkers and ruffians and people that skirted the law. The grand jury was convened in the Pioche courthouse. The grand jury concluded that Schuler Henry acted in self-defense. Or you could say that there was no proof that Schuler Henry didn't act in self-defense, so no charges were brought against him. Pioche was the county seat of Lincoln County and was 175 miles from Las Vegas. Las Vegas at the time was part of Lincoln County. The reason why this matter was taken up in Pioche is because there was no marshal, sheriff, or government presence in Las Vegas in 1884. Even 6 years later, in 1900, there were only 3 ranches and 18 residents in Las Vegas. The 2 ranches belonging to Kiel and Helen Stewart, and the 3rd ranch belonging to a man named James Wilson, called the Sandstone Ranch, out in the Red Rock Canyon area. Helen tried unsuccessfully to sell the Las Vegas ranch after Archibald's death. Then, with the help of her father, Hiram, she ran the ranch and began to purchase adjacent properties in anticipation of a railroad being built through the area. Helen Stewart eventually became the largest landowner in what was then Lincoln County. In 1899, Helen Stewart faced the loss of her youngest son, Archie, who had died earlier that year in a horse riding accident on the ranch. This was the son she was pregnant with 15 years earlier when her husband was killed. In 1900, it had been 16 years since the death of her husband. At the Kiel Ranch, the 2 Kiel brothers, Edwin, 53, and William, 51, owned and ran the ranch upon the passing of their father, Conrad Kiel, in 1894. But on October the 11th, 1900, both brothers were found dead at the ranch in what was ruled at the time to be a murder-suicide. But in the mid-1970s, UNLV forensic anthropologists exhumed the bodies of Edwin and William Kiel. After careful examination, the findings were that their deaths were a double murder, not a murder-suicide. As mentioned before, a lot of unsavory characters came and went from the Kiel Ranch, so the Kiel brothers could easily have had enemies. Or it's been suggested that perhaps Helen Stewart or her sons exacted revenge after 16 years. But this seems very unlikely. Conrad Kiel passed away 6 years prior in 1894. What satisfaction would be gained? To get even with a dead man who is beyond grieving? Would the Stewarts have kept this vengeance a secret for 16 years, and then for the rest of their lives? I don't believe this is the kind of person Helen Stewart was. There is a link in the description to the story of the death of the two Kiel brothers. In 1893, Helen Stewart became the first postmaster of Las Vegas, though the name was spelled Los Vegas until 1903, so as not to be confused with the much larger Las Vegas, New Mexico. Here is a photo from about 1901. A man named Frank Stewart, no relation to Archibald Stewart, was the foreman at Helen Stewart's ranch. In this photo, he's standing on the left. Helen is standing next to him in the black dress, with her 4 surviving children. Helen and Frank were married in 1903. In 1902, Helen Stewart sold 1,834 acres of her ranch, including the water rights, to the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad for $55,000. She kept 160 acres for herself. But Helen wasn't the only person that wanted to benefit from a railroad coming through Las Vegas. There was John T. McWilliams. John McWilliams was a land and water surveyor hired in 1902 by the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad. His task was surveying the nearly 2,000 acres the railroad had just purchased from Helen Stewart. With the insider information of the railroad coming through the area, John McWilliams bought 80 acres of land just west of the railroad land in 1904. By the beginning of 1905, McWilliams Township had restaurants, blacksmiths, drug and general stores, and Las Vegas's first bank, the First State Bank. Here is a photo of the bank taken in 1905. Over 2,000 people lived in the McWilliams Township in 1905, but it lacked one important thing: water. Residents were forced to lug their drinking and bathing water from several wells dug throughout the community. This was not convenient. Of the 1,834 acres of land that Helen Stewart sold to the railroad, 110 acres was subdivided into 40 blocks, comprising 1,200 lots, some of which on Fremont Street sold for as much as $1,750. The auction of these lots was held on May the 15th and 16th, 1905. Unlike the McWilliams Township on the west side of the railroad tracks, the lots on the east side of the tracks that were auctioned by the railroad had running water. This land was much more desirable, and people began to move from the McWilliams townsite. Some residents put their buildings on skids and hauled them to the railroad land on the east side of the tracks. Within a few weeks, the McWilliams townsite was all but abandoned. Today, there is a marker located near the corner of West McWilliams Avenue and H Street commemorating the McWilliams townsite. 4 years later, in 1909, Clark County was created with Las Vegas as the county seat. Clark County is named after William A. Clark, who was a U.S. Senator, copper magnate, and the man who purchased Helen Stewart's ranch and brought his railroad to Las Vegas in 1904. Here is a map of Clark County, Nevada, shown at bottom. Prior to 1909, all the land of Clark County was part of Lincoln County. In 1911, Las Vegas was incorporated as a city. That same year, Helen Stewart donated 10 acres of land to the Paiute tribe, creating the Las Vegas Indian Colony. This was the tribe's first communal land. Helen Stewart also donated land in 1922 for the Las Vegas Grammar School. Helen Stewart became an important part of social, political, and business circles in Las Vegas and is known today as the First Lady of Las Vegas. Helen Stewart passed away in Las Vegas in 1926. In the early 1900s, almost all the roadways and features shown on this map did not exist. There weren't even any paved streets in Las Vegas until 1923, but it's helpful to see the proximity of what did exist. The McWilliams Township was situated between Bonanza Road and Washington Avenue, and A and H streets. The 110 acres of land the railroad auctioned off in 1905 became downtown Las Vegas. Here you can see the railroad tracks that were built in 1904 and still in use today. At present-day Las Vegas Boulevard and Washington Avenue was the home of Helen Stewart and the remnants of the Old Mormon Fort. Today, this site is the old Las Vegas Mormon Fort State Historic Park, and the grounds are open to the public. Here is the location of the Kiel Ranch. Today, 7 acres of the ranch is now the Kiel Ranch Historic Park and is also open to the public. It is located at 2465 Kiel Way, North Las Vegas. Here is the 10-acre parcel of land that Helen Stewart gifted to the Paiute tribe in 1911. It is known today as the Las Vegas Indian Colony. It is located at 1225 North Main Street, Las Vegas. 17 miles to the southwest of downtown Las Vegas, well beyond the map shown here, was Jim Wilson's Sandstone Ranch, one of only 3 ranches in Las Vegas in 1900. Today, this ranch is part of the Spring Mountain Ranch State Park, and Jim Wilson's ranch house is preserved. In 1955, Vera Krupp bought the Sandstone Ranch and renamed it the Spring Mountain Ranch. Vera Krupp had married German industrialist Alfred Krupp, a business magnate in Germany, whose company was the largest producer of armaments for Germany during World War II. They were divorced in 1957. Howard Hughes purchased the ranch from Vera Krupp in 1967. Howard Hughes already owned 25,000 acres of land in the Las Vegas Valley that he purchased in 1952, which he named Summerlin after his paternal grandmother, Jean Amelia Summerlin. Much has changed in Las Vegas over the years, but the early history is compelling. Just 200 years ago, there was only a natural setting, and the only neon lights were cast by the sun.